all the members for joining us. My name is Michael Ellison, and I am the very inexperienced chair. So, General Statute 138A-15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please so state at this time. Seeing none, we'll move on to approval of the minutes from the July meeting.
Chairman, slight correction. It would appear that on the attendance component, my name is spelled incorrectly. So I'd like to point that out. That is ED instead of OD.
Do you mind if we approve them and thank you?
Absolutely, with that correction. And furthermore, I will make a motion to approve with that correction.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve. We have a second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from the July meeting. All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, say no. Unanimous. Minutes are approved. So we have some information items. The update on the air curtain incinerator rule revisions, which has been a persistent item in our agenda for the longest time. Yes.
So if I may offer, Mr. Chairman, before we get into that item, there was an earlier version of the agenda that had an action item on it for the non-emergency engine rules. And so I just wanted to call on Katie Quinlan briefly, just to give us a quick 30-second synopsis as to why those were delayed and when we can expect them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Yes, we had an action item. We were planning on requesting approval of the non-emergency engines Title V exclusionary rule. And we've been working on that. We presented a concept for that in July, and we're planning on presenting the request for approval by the committee of that rule package in November. So we've been working on that, particularly the regulatory impact analysis, as well as the factors to make sure that we are updating the throughput limits to the most accurate, use the most accurate and up-to-date factors. And we've been working with OSBM, having some back and forth, and found some ways to improve the regulatory impact analysis with a different approach than we had originally taken. And we're very close to getting that approved, but ultimately wanted to make sure that you all had enough time to review those materials. Didn't want to post them too close to the date of the meeting. Want to make sure I'll have ample time to review those before being asked to take an action. So we've decided to defer that until January. We think we'll have those materials ready very soon for your review before that meeting.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Now the update on the air curtain incinerator.
Hi, I am Anna Delahunt with the DAQ, and today I'm presenting an update on proposed revisions to 15A NCAC 02D 1904 air curtain incinerators and 15A NCAC 02Q 810 air curtain burners. So here's a list of acronyms that we use throughout the presentation, just for you to reference. So some background. Federal regulations set standards for different types of incinerators, including commercial and industrial solid waste incineration, or CISB units, and other solid waste incineration, or OSWI units. These categories both include air curtain incinerators, or ACIs. Earlier in 2025, the DAQ initiated the rulemaking to amend two air quality rules, 02D 1904 and 02Q 810, primarily to align the rules with recent changes to the federal regulations for ACIs. The federal regulations for CISB units are found in 40 CFR Part 60, subparts Quad C and Quad D. These regulations set requirements for certain ACIs, which are termed CISWE ACIs. A CISWE ACI is an ACI with a capacity of greater than or equal to 35 tons per day that burns only 100% wood waste, 100% clean lumber, or a 100% mixture of only wood waste, clean lumber, and yard waste. The federal regulations for OSB units are found in 40 CFR Part 60, subparts Quad E and Quad F. Certain ACIs are only subject to a small subset of subparts Quad E and Quad F, and these are termed OSB ACIs. These OSB ACIs include ACIs with a capacity of less than 35 tons per day that burn only 100% wood waste, 100% clean lumber, 100% yard waste, or 100% mixture of these materials, collected from the general public and from residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial sources, and ACIs located at institutional facilities that burn any amount of only these materials, and when those materials are generated at that institutional facility. 15A NCAC O2D 1904 sets conditions for the operation of ACIs, including applicability, permitting, opacity limitations, performance tests, and record-keeping requirements. The existing rule requires Title V permits for all ACIs, except for temporary use OSB ACIs used in disaster recovery. On August 31st, 2020, the EPA performed a 5-year review of the NSPS and emission guidelines for OSB units. Following this review, the EPA proposed changes to the NSPS and emission guidelines for OSB units, including removing the Title V permitting requirement for OSB ACIs. On April 17, 2024, the EPA finalized the elimination of the Title V permitting requirement for OSB ACIs. On October 10, 2024, the General Assembly passed House Bill 149, also known as the Disaster Recovery Act of 2024, in response to Hurricane Helene. Section 10.5C of the Act stated that owners and operators of permanent and temporary ACIs, subject to 40 CFR Part 60, subparts Quad E and Quad F, shall not be required to obtain a Title V permit. This change applies to OSB ACIs and is consistent with EPA's final action to revise the federal OSB rules in April 2024. Section 10.5D requires that the EMC amend Rule O2D 1904 to be consistent with Section 10.5C, which will be in effect until the revised permanent rule is effective. Earlier in 2025, the DAQ proposed to amend Rule O2D 1904 to remove the Title V permitting requirement for OSB ACIs, pursuant to the Disaster Recovery Act, and to align with federal rules. The DAQ also proposed clarifying changes to the monitoring, record-keeping, and reporting provisions based on comments from DAQ staff. Pursuant to Section 10.5D of the Disaster Recovery Act, Rule O2D 1904 does not require approval by the RRC, but will instead go before the General Assembly for review. The DAQ also proposed to modify the exclusionary limit in 15A NCAC O2Q 810 to reflect updated emission factors and clarify that the rule does not supersede the permanent requirements of Rule O2D 1904. So for our public comment period and hearing, the public comment period for this rulemaking was held from July 1st to September 2nd. A hybrid in-person and virtual public hearing was held on August 19, 2025, with former Commissioner Weiss serving as the hearing officer. The DAQ received comments from industry about removing the opacity monitoring requirements. The Southern Environmental Law Center commented on the emission factors used in O2Q 810, as well as on the fiscal note, setback requirements, and compliance assurance. They also requested that the DAQ evaluate the EPA's interim final rule exempting temporary use ACIs used in disaster recovery from the applicable federal requirements. EPA Region 4 commented asking for clarification on the language used in Rule O2D 1904 in relation to North Carolina's state implementation plan. On August 22nd, the EPA issued an interim final rule allowing for CISWE units to obtain a temporary exemption from standards during disaster response. This exemption for temporary use ACIs used in disaster recovery already exists for OSB units, which is reflected in Rule O2D 1904. The action was issued without prior notice or opportunity for public comment because of the need for ACIs for disaster recovery and a similarity to the long-standing OSWI temporary use provisions. This rule was effective immediately upon publication. New and existing SISWI ACIs can take advantage of the exemption. The comment period for this interim final rule ended on October 10, 2025. So, looking to the future, the EPA has indicated that there are plans to consolidate provisions for ACIs that burn only wood waste, clean lumber, and yard waste into a single location and resolve inconsistencies in certain Clean Air Act Section 129 rules. Currently, emission standards for ACIs are spread across 4 different source categories: large municipal waste combustors, small municipal waste combustors, SISWI units, and OSWI units. There could also be changes to the interim final rule for temporary use of SISWI ACIs using disaster recovery. Additionally, the DAQ is evaluating additional revisions to Rule 02D 1904 to improve clarity and efficacy. So as you can see, a lot has happened since we started this rulemaking. Here's a timeline to help lay it out more. On the left, you can see the state actions. You can see the path that our rulemaking has taken. On the right, you can see the federal actions. You can see that quite a few things have happened since we started our rulemaking. You can see that there are additional revisions to the OSWI rules and that the interim final rule for SISWI ACIs was issued during our public hearing comment period. And at the bottom, you can see that 1904 still has to go to get legislative review, and that we are expecting potential changes to the SISWI interim final rule based on public comments, and we are expecting consolidation of the ACI rules. So with all this happening, the DAQ plans to pause this rulemaking until the EPA has finalized changes to the federal requirements for ACIs. There's already a lot of uncertainty around these rules, and we don't want to make it more confusing by presenting a rule that is incomplete or inaccurate. And we don't want to waste your time, our time, or the General Assembly's time by presenting a rule that is already obsolete. And because of the language in the Disaster Recovery Act and in the SISWI interim final rule, the facilities can already take advantage of these changes. They aren't waiting on our state rulemaking to be able to take advantage. So the DAQ will conduct a future rulemaking that encompasses the changes to the Title V permitting requirements, the EPA's recent SISWI temporary use provisions, and anticipated future revisions to the federal requirements for ACIs. And like I said, in the meantime, OSWI and SISWI ACIs can still take advantage of the recent EPA changes to their respective federal requirements. Thank you. Any questions?
Any questions? Any discussion? Okay. Seeing none, we will move on. Director's comments? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Update on rule readoption process and anticipated actions on federal air quality regulations. Ms. Quinlan?
All right, good morning. All right, good morning. I'm Katie Quinlan with the Rule Development Branch of the Division of Air Quality. And I'll be giving an update on our rule readoption process for our air quality rules and also some anticipated actions on federal air quality regulations. So this is just a slide with some acronyms to reference as you go throughout the presentation. And I'll start by just noting that on March 12th, Administrator Zeldin announced that the US EPA would undertake 31 deregulatory actions. And those actions are focused on energy, living, and cooperative federalism. And you might recall back in July, Director Abrasinskis gave an information item presentation on these 31 deregulatory actions and what we knew at that time. So I'll go over those again, the same actions, but provide any updates, anything that has happened since then, proposals, as well as take a slightly different angle and kind of show how it may or may not interact with our upcoming rule readoption process. So first, under the energy-related category, the first line item there is the reconsideration of the greenhouse gas regulations on power plants. Back in June, EPA proposed to repeal those regulations, and they took comment on that through August. This will not have an impact on any existing EMC air quality regulations. You might recall that last year, we were in the process of developing some rules to implement the emission guideline portion of those federal regulations under 111D. We presented a concept, I think it was last July, and then an information item update in January on that rulemaking. But following EPA's announcement in March to reconsider those, we put that on pause to kind of wait for further information from the EPA. And it has been proposed for repeal, so we're just waiting on further information. But there's no existing rules on the books for that item, so we don't expect it to impact our readoption process. And then the next one on the list is in a similar situation. That's the reconsideration of the oil and gas regulations. There was an interim final rule that was put out in July to just extend some deadlines, including the state plan deadline that we were under. But as far as we understand, there's still a broader reconsideration that we're expecting to come shortly. It was in a similar situation to the first line item, meaning that we were in the process of developing some rules and a regulatory impact analysis to implement those federal regulations under the 111D portion of that action. But again, we presented a concept and an information item update, but the committee did not take any official action on those rules. So there's no rules on the books to implement those. So we don't expect any impact on our existing rules or the readoption process. Third, we have the reconsideration of the recently tightened mercury and air toxic standards, or MATS rule. We do not expect this to impact any existing EMC rules. There were very few, if any, sources in North Carolina that were affected by those 2024 MATS rule amendments that EPA is reconsidering. And then EPA did propose back in June, alongside the reconsideration of the greenhouse gas standards for power plants, they also made a proposal to reconsider those MATS rule amendments as well from 2024, and they took comment on that through August. There's also a reconsideration of the greenhouse gas reporting program. That does not impact existing EMC rules, although we will note that EPA did propose that recently to reconsider that reporting program, and they took comment on that through November 3rd, so just last week. So we're waiting on further action there. We may have some possible amendments to some of our rules under EPA's reconsideration of the recent risk management program, or RMP rule, under Clean Air Act Section 112R. But the nature of what those amendments might look like will highly depend on what EPA takes there. And as you can see, they have not proposed any action there yet. The last two on this slide are reconsideration of some effluent limitation guidelines. These are not air quality related items, so those wouldn't affect any air related rules. So next, under the cost of living related category, there is a reconsideration of the vehicle greenhouse gas rules, and then also reconsideration of the 2009 endangerment finding for the regulation of greenhouse gases and related rules. So EPA on July 1st, for both of these items, came out with a proposal. They proposed to repeal the vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards, and they proposed a reconsideration to rescind that 2009 endangerment finding for greenhouse gases. These are not incorporated into existing EMC rules, so we don't expect that to have any impact on existing rules. But they did take comment on that through September 22nd. Next is a reconsideration of technology transition rules, such as refrigeration. This does not impact any existing EMC rules, although EPA has also not proposed any action there. We may have a possible amendment to Rule 2D 410. You might recall that earlier this year, I think it became effective on March 1st. We revised that rule to reflect the 2024 final revision to the PM 2.5 National Ambient Air Quality Standard, where in 2024, EPA lowered that standard from 12.0 micrograms per cubic meter to 9.0 micrograms per cubic meter. So we updated Rule 2D410 to incorporate or reflect that lowered standard, and now EPA has announced that they will be revisiting that standard. So depending on the outcome of that revisitation, we may need to then amend Rule 2D410 to reflect that. But we don't have any update on EPA's action. They've not proposed anything yet. So still under the cost of living related category, EPA has said that they plan to reconsider a number of national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, or NESHAP standards. I won't go through all of them, but you can see on the left-hand side, we've listed out the number of facilities in North Carolina that we know to be impacted under each of those industries or subparts. We expect that there could be some possible amendments to some of the rules. I will say that for the most part, we incorporate these NESHAP standards by reference, so there probably wouldn't be a lot, if any, needed changes to our rules, but we'll just have to look at the specifics of what EPA proposes as to whether it does impact any of our rules. So that's why we kind of noted possible amendments, but we'll look at those as they come out and evaluate whether any action is necessary from an EMC air quality rule related standpoint. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there's only been one proposal or one interim final rule to extend some deadlines under one of those subparts, but there's still a broader reconsideration coming. And then we don't have any update on the other subparts or any action from EPA there. So still under the cost of living related category, EPA has announced that they plan to evaluate some other NESHAPs and new source performance standards or NSPS subparts, but we don't know what those are yet. So we've just noted possible amendments. We'll have to see what the nature of those are and what subparts and industries those might affect. But we don't have any proposal from EPA yet for that line item. The EPA has issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking that was just in September for restructuring the regional HAZE program, but this is not under any existing EMC air quality rules, so we don't expect that to impact our readoption process or the timeline for readopting our rules. EPA has also announced an overhauling of the social cost of carbon value. And while we do often reference the social cost of carbon value or use it in our analysis, it's not integrated into our rules necessarily. So not to say it won't have an impact, but it won't impact the existing EMC rules that we're going to propose to be readopting. I will note that EPA in May, or I think it was actually from the White House, put out Memorandum M2527 with some directives towards federal agencies on social cost of carbon and considering greenhouse gases in their regulatory actions. And then the last two items we don't expect to impact EMC air quality rules, and that's redirecting enforcement resources to revise the national enforcement and compliance initiatives and terminating federal environmental justice programs. So this is the last of the tables here. So under the cooperative federalism related category, EPA has announced they plan to end the Good Neighbor Plan program. This does not impact any existing EMC rules on the books, but also EPA is not taking any action there. There's an ongoing effort to resolve the state implementation plan or SIP backlog. Doesn't directly affect any EMC rules. We work with the EPA on our SIP submissions on an ongoing basis, but that won't have a direct impact on air quality rules for the EMC. EPA has announced that they plan to improve the exceptional events rule related to prescribed fires. And this rule does already allow prescribed fires to be considered as exceptional events, but the nature of this improvement is not entirely known yet. So we'll wait to see what kind of proposal EPA makes. But those exceptional event requirements are not integrated into the EMC's rules. So we don't expect it to impact rule readoption. The next one is an update to the coal ash regulations. These are not air-related rules, so it won't affect us for readoption. And then EPA also included an item for enforcement discretion for North Carolina Hurricane Helene recovery. This may have some possible amendments to some rules. As Anna just noted a little while ago, EPA did put out an interim final rule to include disaster provisions for SISWE. For SISWE units, that was just in August. And we'll see if there's any changes to that interim final rule based on the public comments that they received. And then the last item there is a reassessment of the state plan implementing regulations under 40 CFR Part 60 Subpart BA. These do impact our program, and we use these as we develop state plans, but they're not integrated into our state rules. So it won't impact the readoption process. And the only action we've had so far from EPA on that is back in June, they did solicit input from states on those regulations and how to improve them. And we participated in that input. And the last item I'll note is EPA did announce, as Anna just mentioned, an exemption for commercial and industrial solid waste incineration or SISWE units. That was on August 22nd. It was an interim final rule. So it's already in effect, but they did accept comments on that through October 10th. And those disaster provisions, as she mentioned, mirror the disaster provisions that are already existing for OSWE units. And that allows those CISV units to obtain a temporary exemption from standards during disaster response. So as she mentioned, we'll be looking at that and how to integrate that into our existing rules, particularly Rule 2D 1904, which we were in the process of amending. Is there a question?
Yes. Before we leave the tables, can you go back to the tables just quick?
Yes.
And just make a request and the committee chair may feel this is helpful for committee. As managing the whole rule process, I think it'd be helpful for me. I would like to see you switch the second and third column. And when you say yes or possible amendments, it would be very helpful to me and I think the vice chair of the commission to know what rules you think are coming that would require changing. I know you don't have the full text, but as we look at the whole layout of rules readoption, it would be helpful to know which ones you think may be slipping so that being in responsible charge of the rules, we kind of have somebody calls us and asks us, we'll kind of know what rules are may be affected, right? I know this is all best guess, but you do say possible or yes in some cases. So add another column for that or something.
Okay, we can do that. We can kind of refine this chart. Best information we have.
Mr. Chairman, one sort of follow-up on that. What makes it complicated to predict that may be that the state could retain some authority on its own. So a change in the federal rule may or may not require us to amend our rules. And that will likely have to be a case-by-case decision depending on how exactly the federal rule is amended. So I would just hesitate to over-predict what the EMC will have to do. I think you're right. We need to know ultimately what specific rules are potentially affected, but I wouldn't necessarily jump to the conclusion that the EMC has to change the rule in question. So.
And if I may, I agree. I just trying to capture when they said yes or possible, something's in your mind, staff's mind. I'm just trying to get out what's in staff's mind so that we all have it transparently known. Because I agree, some things are wrapped on top of other things, but it's still, you're thinking something there. So I'm just asking for what you might be thinking when you say possible or yes.
Okay, we can do that.
And you can put a date on it too, because I know it's going to change in 3 months too, probably when you start to see what comes out. So, right? I mean,
Yeah, and we may need to be, if there's a lot of them, we may have to prioritize just because of how long it takes us to go through the process.
right.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, yeah, and I think between now and when we actually have to go through the readoption process, we'll fill in a lot of the blanks where it's to be determined on EPA's actions because we anticipate EPA's actions are going to be fairly intense between now and when we start. So we'll have a much better picture of all of this by the time we actually get into that readoption process for the air quality rules.
Yeah, and more of a dynamic spreadsheet, not trying to pin you down to something static, but it's more dynamic. And I'm just saying as leading the whole commission and all the rulemaking, it would help me. I don't know if it helps the committee, but it would help me and probably the vice chair. So.
Is there another? Yes.
And I want to acknowledge that I'm brand new to the Air Quality Committee, and I think maybe this is what a previous question was getting at is, I just want to be clear that if the federal action, which they've said are deregulatory, so we assume that they would be raising allowable concentrations or making the regulations less stringent. If that the state only has to amend our rules if our limits are less stringent than the federal rules. Is that correct?
So it depends. And it depends on the nature of EPA's action and the nature of the rule, how it ties into the Clean Air Act. You know, we do have kind of the hardest amendment issue that we have to be aware of, where we can't be more stringent than a federal regulation if a federal regulation on that subject matter exists. But yes, we also need to make sure that we are meeting EPA's requirements and not being less stringent if they have mandated that something meet a certain level. There are other types of regulations where the state implements them. We are given guidelines and we develop a rule that is equivalent, but it's maybe a little less prescriptive and we have some decision-making ability there. And then there's just all kinds of other regulations under different parts of the Clean Air Act where there's different dynamics at play in terms of the authority that the state has versus EPA and how we may or may not incorporate those into our rules. If it comes down to like a reporting requirement, then we may need to make sure that we are, meeting at least that reporting requirement that EPA has established, but it really depends on the nature of the rule, how it's tied into the Clean Air Act, how it's tied into our state rules, and how we implement that. That somewhat answers your question.
I guess I thought there were cases where we could be more stringent than federal.
If the EPA, my understanding is that if there's a federal standard on a certain subject matter, then we cannot be more stringent than that standard or more restrictive. Now, if there is no federal standard on a certain subject matter, then we can implement our own rule, and then there's no partisan amendment issue at play here. I can see Commissioner Smith, who probably understands this a lot better, can add it to that.
Mr. Chair, so I think we have two levels of things going on. One is, you're correct. I mean, under federal law, there's no prohibition against the state being more restrictive than a federal standard. But we do have some state law restrictions, specifically on environmental rules, that don't allow us to be more restrictive if there is a specific federal rule that addresses the issue, although there are also exceptions even to that for emergencies, public health and safety. So it's not a complete prohibition even then, which means it does have to be sort of a case-by-case review of what the federal change is, what the state rule is, and how that state restriction applies.
Thank you.
Okay, back to it.
All right.
If you can find your place.
All right, I think I covered this slide. This is really just a summary of what Anna already gave you in more detail, but it was just a last note of another change that we may need to incorporate, or that we very likely will need to incorporate into our state rules. So now I'll kind of pivot to where we are in our periodic review of existing rules or rule readoption process. So our initial determination reports for all of the rules in subchapters 2D and 2Q categorized, those reports categorized all of our existing air quality rules as necessary. And the Air Quality Committee and the EMC approved those initial determinations of necessary to proceed to public comment. We held that comment period from May through July, and we did not receive any public comments on those determinations. So the final reports continued to categorize all of the rules as necessary. And the EMC adopted those final determinations in September, I believe. So we filed those final agency determination reports with the Rules Review Commission for review at their December meeting as required by the schedule. And then after the RRC reviews those reports, they will send them to the Administrative Procedures Oversight, or APO Committee of the General Assembly before they become final. And then once the reports become final, DAQ will work with the Office of Administrative Hearing Staff and, of course, the EMC to establish the timeline and deadline for actually completing the next round of readoption for all of the O2D and O2Q rules. So we'll consider all of the recent changes to federal rules, the expected changes to federal rules when determining and mapping out that timeline for all of our air quality rules. And as Director Avison has mentioned, we expect to have a lot more information on many of these to be determined items from EPA to help us be able to determine the right timeline for those. So the next few slides, I'll just cover some rules that we have already identified and are looking at as potential repeals or amendments that we may take during the rule readoption process. So the first of that is a potential repeal of Rule 2D 403, and that is the rule for the ambient standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for Total Suspended Particulates, or TSP. Now, that TSP NAAQS was replaced with PM10 in 1987. And so DAQ is evaluating the potential impacts of repealing this ambient standard rule. But there's a lot of research that needs to be done, and we're doing that right now, including but not limited to looking at, in particular, our 2D 500 rules. There's many rules in this section that set particulate standards for particular emission limits for certain source categories. And so we need to look at those closely, understand how they were determined when they were adopted many years ago, and what they were based on, and whether they need to be recalculated to be based on the current, use the current NAAQS standards. We also need to look at NSPS applicability for particulate matter, and then following through to any permitting impacts of potentially repealing that rule. So we're looking at it, but there's a lot of work, a lot of research that needs to be done, and we're doing that right now to be ready to have a potential action during the readoption process. Another potential repeal may be our inspection and maintenance rules. And you may recall that back in 2023, House Bill 259 was passed, and that removed 18 counties from the inspection and maintenance program. It left only Mecklenburg County in that program, but the changes to those 18 counties don't become effective until after EPA approves an amendment to our North Carolina SIP to reflect that legislative change. So the DAQ submitted an I&M SIP revision requesting EPA to remove the counties from the program. And that accompanying that was a Section 110L non-interference demonstration that we submitted to EPA, which essentially is required whenever we're relaxing a requirement in our SIP. And that is a demonstration to EPA to show that removal or relaxation of that requirement will not interfere with our ability to attain or maintain compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So we performed that analysis, we included it with our SIP revision, and we submitted it to EPA on October 1st of last year. And I will note that that SIP amendment actually included an analysis that removal of all 19 counties will not interfere with our ability to maintain the NAAQS. Even though Mecklenburg County will remain in the program, we went ahead and did an analysis, a conservative analysis that removal of all 19 counties will not affect our ability to maintain compliance with the NAAQS. So EPA has up to 18 months to review that I&M SIP and non-interference demonstration and take a final action. If they approve the submittal, then the DEQ secretary will submit a certification letter of the SIP approval by EPA to the revisor of statutes. And then the DMV will implement the changes beginning on the first day of a month, that is 60 days after the secretary submits that certification. So subsequent to EPA's removal of the SIP amendment, we will look at potentially repealing or proposing for repeal the corresponding 2D 1000 rules. Those are the rules that outlined those requirements. So we have noted that as a potential set of rules that may be unnecessary in the future, but they're still necessary right now, which is why we included them as such in the reports. It's just not time to repeal them yet. So just a couple others that we've already noted may need to be amended as a result of forthcoming action on EPA's deregulatory agenda. One I mentioned earlier, 2D 410, that's our rule for PM 2.5 particulate matter that reflects the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. We lowered it from 12 to 9 last year to reflect EPA's final action. So depending on, EPA has announced their plan to revisit it. So depending on the outcome of that revisitation, we may need to further amend that rule. So we've noted that one. And then as both Anna and I have already mentioned, 2D 1904 for air curtain incinerators. One, to incorporate the temporary use SISWE disaster recovery provisions, but also even broader, the expected action from EPA to consolidate all of those ACI provisions from the various federal rules that they're in right now into, maybe one set of federal rules is what we are understanding, and resolve any inconsistencies. And they're doing that to resolve any inconsistencies in certain 129 rules. So that concludes my presentation, and with that, I can take any questions that you may have.
But recognizing you're juggling watermelons and chainsaws, what's your best guess for when the department can start to narrow down map out this process? EPA's timelines are all over the place. I understand it's not easy, but just again, for planning and prioritization, we're going to look to you for a plan on how to move forward. When do you think things will tighten up for a valid plan?
So my understanding of the actual readoption process, if our reports for readoption get approved by the RRC in December, then they go before the APO committee. And then following that, when they become final, then we work on actually establishing the timeline for readoption. And so at that point, we'll be working on it in the meantime, but at that point, I think we will actually need to start mapping out in a slightly more concrete way our plan, at least for readoption. Now, we will, and so I would expect that to be, second quarter of next year or later, potentially, depending on when. I believe what will happen is the OAH or the RRC staff contact us to request, to map out the schedule, and then we bring that before the EMC, that proposed schedule. So at that point, we will have to start nailing down at least some things based on what we know at that time. I will note that for things that maybe if we don't know them at that time, we may do those in separate rulemaking actions. If we're not able to incorporate them into the the readoption process, we can do another rulemaking, separate, like we always do, an amendment or separate repeal, if that's the pathway that needs to happen. Or we can, potentially kind of shelf that rule for later in the readoption process when we know more information. If the readoption is going to take, several years, then maybe we don't do that in the first set that we bring before you for readoption. We have over 300 rules, so we don't bring them all at one time. Last time we separated them into 6 groups. Last time we separated them into 6 groups, and so we brought them in phases. So, maybe we leave that for one of the later groups when we will have more information.
So realistically, next summer before you can.
That's my best guess at this time.
No, and I know that it's, there tremendous uncertainty both between EPA and then potential court actions and all that. So, okay. Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Yes.
Yes. I was wondering, there aren't really all that many where you think there's possible amendments for the deregulatory actions. That's what it looks like. But for those where there are possible amendments, going back to the Hardison amendments and how we understand those, are there any, or one thing I'd like to see, are any of those just completely deregulating it, which would leave it open for the state to regulate an area? So it's just something I wanted you to think about with your next presentation is it just taking out a whole program so we could actually leave our program in place because that's now gone at the federal level, which allows us to be stricter? Do you see what I mean?
Right, that's a good point. And that's something we'll look into. There's nothing that comes to mind right now as, definitely meeting that particular scenario where if EPA were to completely remove that program, we either keep ours in place or establish one, because now there's no Hardison Amendment issue. There's nothing that's jumping to mind in that category right now, but we can definitely keep it in mind and see if there's anything on that list of 31 actions that might fit that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just procedural, we need to talk about, because we talked, Mike and I, and you've talked about it offline in council. So if you go back to the total, the TSP versus the PM10, that was replaced. Now, the rules that we had that went to the RRC, and this is for transparency and open honesty, staff said it was necessary, right? It went to a public comment and nobody said it wasn't necessary. So that was brought before this committee and before the whole EMC, and we voted on it last time as saying it was necessary. I look at that and I say, well, is that necessary or unnecessary? Right? And then if it's wrapped up in other programs, it would be unnecessary. It would be necessary. If it's not wrapped up and should have been taken away 40 years ago, it's unnecessary. Nonetheless, we're going to present this to the RRC as being necessary. Okay, so that would go, it's already gone to the RRC to get on their December agenda. Okay, and now what council has advised, I'll let her tell me, I'm trying to paraphrase it, is because we went through a public comment period, staff thought it was necessary, went through public comment period, nobody said it was unnecessary, that to revert the action and try to reverse that as necessary or unnecessary probably is not the thing to do. But communication with RRC council on some of this information, that some of these have been marked necessary but may change, when we go through readoption is probably the way to do that. So it's a letter to the RC to be open and transparent so that they know as we schedule these things, we have marked them necessary, but clearly some may not be necessary. So I guess I asked the committee, I did not want to bring this to the full commission. I didn't think this was something the whole commission needed to vote it on unless this air quality committee told us that some other course was needed. So Mike, I mean, it's Michael, it's up to you and council. If I've made any misstatements here, please correct me.
Yeah, just to clarify, what's going before the RRC in December is the list of all the air rules that you've bucketed as necessary or unnecessary. Rules that are designated as unnecessary expire and are removed from the code once that report is finalized. Rules that are marked as necessary, you all will have a chance to look at again and as part of the readoption process. And depending on what DAQ finds as a result of their studies on these rules, as a result of looking back at the deregulatory action that EPA took in the past or is going to be taking going forward, you all can look at the rules and decide that they are no longer in fact necessary and repeal them during the readoption process. So because these reports have already been out to public comment, I think it would be inappropriate to revise and say these certain rules are now unnecessary without having a chance for the public to look at that. But don't think that that means that you all are wedded to maintaining these rules if in fact there are actions that need to take place to get them off of the books down the road. In my conversations with Chair Ellison, Chair Solomon, Director Abrazinskis, we talked about letting the RRC just know that there are obviously some pending EPA actions at play. We're looking at some rules that may not need to be on our books going forward, but for our purposes on that initial designation report, we're not changing anything that's already you all have already approved and the commission has already approved.
But that communication has not yet gone to the RRC.
No, that will go by the 20th of this month. And I'm working with DEQ's rules coordinator to make sure that that communication goes to the RRC. And then I will be present at the RRC meeting to take any questions that they may have. Or I can I can certainly request to present at the RRC as well, just to clarify and, be transparent about where we all are.
Just a question about that. So that would be a general letter, not identifying specific rules.
Correct.
But generally notifying the Rules Review Commission that there are a lot of things in play that may cause the commission to decide later that rules identified as necessary initially actually are no longer necessary, and so would be subject to repeal.
Yeah, and I mean, the RRC sees this all the time, and in fact, the way that they review the necessary, unnecessary designations is different than the way they review final rules. But I think just noting for them that we are aware that there are things changing on the outside that could affect the necessity of some of these rules being presented as necessary today. But yes, is the short answer.
Any other comments on this communication issue with RRC? Okay. Any other questions on the presentation? Discussion? Okay, then we'll move on to director remarks.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to everyone. I'd like to call on Deputy Director Taylor Hartsfield to give a quick update on a topic that intersects with the first two topics we've discussed today, both Anna's presentation and slide 9 of Katie's presentation related to the use of air curtain incinerators and the federal rules that have been apply and that have changed at the federal level while we're in the middle of a state comment period on our changes to our existing rules. But Taylor's going to give an update and expand upon what I gave y'all an update on in September with relation to biochar units, which are slightly different than the air curtain incinerators. But Taylor, why don't you take it away? Thanks.
All right. Good morning, commissioners. So as you heard this morning from Anna and again from Katie, on August 26, 2025, EPA published in the Federal Register an interim final rule that impacted SISWI temporary use ACIs used in disaster recovery. This interim final rule was effective upon publication, but allowed for a 45-day public comment period, and potential changes could be forthcoming. The practical impact of this action meant that our division did not need to seek an extension of EPA's no action assurance for SISWI ACIs used for processing Hurricane Helene disaster debris. The no action assurance that we previously had expired effectively on September 1st, 2025. Now, SISWI ACIs, similar to OSWI ACIs, used for managing disaster debris, can be exempt from permitting and other federal rule requirements, provided that they follow certain notification procedures outlined in those rules. So shortly after this action, I requested clarification from EPA's Region 4 staff about the impacts of this interim final rule for biochar units. As a reminder, I gave a previous update that on June 23rd, 2024, EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery issued a letter to Tiger Cats. And sorry, I said 2024, it was on 2025. Just caught that typo. EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery issued a letter to Tiger Cat's legal counsel in response to their request for a non-hazardous secondary material, or NHSM, determination for wood waste, yard waste, and clean lumber that is processed into biochar. This letter from EPA's Office of Resource and Conservation and Recovery states, as long as equipment used to produce a biochar product is only processing clean cellulosic biomass as defined in 40 CFR 241.2, the feedstock would not be considered a solid waste or secondary material for the purposes of the Clean Air Act, and therefore the processing equipment would not be subject to Clean Air Act Section 129 standards. A contact from this same EPA office provided a clarifying email to EPA Region 4 staff on September 8th, 2025, after the interim final rule. And it clarifies that the NHSM program is a voluntary federal program, and affected entities are not required to manage their NHSMs as non-waste fuels. Therefore, there is no regulatory impediment to using units that produce biochar in the disaster recovery efforts under the Clean Air Act Section 129 standards, including the new interim final rule. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, our EPA Region 4 contacts, in coordination with the Office of Air and Radiation and the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, have clarified to us that biochar units like Tiger Cat 6040 carbonizer can, quote, opt in to the new provisions for SISWI temporary use ACIs used in disaster recovery if they make it clear that the material that they are processing, which is vegetative disaster debris, is a waste. This means these units can avoid permitting if they follow the federal rule notification requirements. However, if the vegetative materials processed are not from a natural disaster, like from land clearing activities or routine property maintenance, then the material they are processing is a non-hazardous secondary material, or NHSM. And while the Clean Air Act Section 129 standards may not apply, air quality permitting may apply based on the emissions profile of the units. So on October 17th, 2025, Mark Suella, DAQ's permitting section chief, and I met with Matt O'Connor, product specialist for Tiger Cat, and his legal counsel, Robert Myers. We presented both options, how they can opt into being considered a temporary use ACI used in disaster recovery if they are processing vegetative disaster debris and avoid permitting, or the option for seeking a permit if processing vegetative materials not generated from a disaster. The Tiger Cat representative expressed interest in working with NCDAQ to develop a general synthetic minor permit for the 6040 carbonizers, as their use in the state in the future may go beyond disaster debris processing. The Tiger Cat representative was open to the opt-in as an ACI pathway, but only for the units operating in Western North Carolina processing solely disaster debris. Currently, there are two, one in Haywood County and one in Yancey County, that are or will be in use for this purpose. So our next steps are to continue to work with Tiger Cat and their counsel on this general synthetic minor permit process for future owners and operators of their 60/40 carbonizers. They expressed appreciation to NCDAQ for our work to seek regulatory clarity from EPA as it relates to their biochar units and our promotion of those units as a lower emitting alternative to open burning. So thank you, and I can take any questions that you may have.
Chair Solomon.
The Tiger Cat people are like Caterpillar or Flight or any manufacturer, so they have an interest in selling this statewide forever. So that's who you're working with there. What does the individual owner operators, because that's who gets the permits, right?
Right.
So they have to come see you to get the actual permit. So they may want the exception, or they may not want to wait on the general permit. That takes, how long do you think to create? Months, right?
Well, generally by statute, our synthetic minor permits are a 90-day process. So now creating a template for a general synthetic minor permit, we're working on the steps and what that will take and whether or not it may have to, the first general synthetic minor permit, whether it may need to go through a public process.
But for these two owner operators in the disaster zone right now.
Yes, they can opt into taking the, basically opt into being considered processing a waste, which makes the pathway for them to be considered an ACI, which means they don't need to receive a permit. But they have to present that to us, that is the option that they're taking.
So that's more of a 30-day process of sending you a letter and you acknowledge it back.
Oh yeah, even shorter, because they just have to give us a notification. The notification requirements are, they can operate up to 8 weeks without the notification. If they want to operate beyond 8 weeks, they have to notify us of the unit. And then if they want to operate beyond 16 weeks, they have to ask for an extension. And we've been given clarity from EPA that we can extend that period as long as we need to process the disaster debris.
Okay, thank you.
So to make sure I'm clear,
Yes.
they can get the exception now
Yes, for those two units
that are
that are
only doing.
only
storm
processing
debris.
disaster debris.
And
Yes.
at the same time, they can be pursuing the permit that would let them do other projects in other parts of the state for other purposes.
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes. And so that's more of what Tiger Cat sees as their future business for these units, is it would go beyond the processing of only disaster debris.
Any other questions from the committee on this issue? The chair recognizes Commissioner Yarborough, who has been wound mighty tightly into this whole situation. And
Yeah, I'll be right here.
No, this is a hug. I tell you, I just want to thank the DAQ and leadership here for what you've done. It was totally unique operation, opportunity. The first time that machine had ever been in the South, and it was deposited. And sometimes God has a way to help you, and this is one of them. And so I'm looking forward to working with it. Thank you, and thank you for being willing to take this to point, because it was the first time I heard about the permitting thing, it didn't look like we were going to be able to do it. So I thought we was going to have to try to move that machine and hide it at night, you know, so.
And Mr. Yarborough, for the record, let's for new members, you have no economic involvement in any of this.
Absolutely
So
not.
Tell
And
them what you do. You're the soil
so
conservation.
I chair the Soil and Water District there in Haywood. We lost our mill, pulp mill, about 5 years ago. So there was absolutely no way to do anything with pulp. And then we had Tropical Storm Fred, deposited all this debris, turned into mulch that's absolutely worthless, an environmental issue. Now we have Helene. I've worked with biochar for, the idea of it for many decades. And this is the first time we actually could have a machine that can make that product at an economic on a scale. So it's, to have all this come together, sometimes, hardship makes things work. But again, I can't thank you enough. You went to the EPA, you did the hard work. When you just said that they won't have an exception and we can start work very quickly. I asked Mike the other day, I said, what if we start Thursday when I'm leaving? So I give him Raleigh. But anyway, thank you. To everybody here and the secretary, you've just appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
Back to the director's comments.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I said at the July meeting when Taylor got applause for her remarks on this topic, I was jealous, and because it's the first time in 2 decades, I think anything we've ever said has garnered applause from the commission, and now I'm jealous that someone got a hug and I didn't. So, but thank you for your remarks, Taylor and Commissioner Yarborough. I'll keep my remarks brief. I have prepared remarks I'll save for the full commission tomorrow. That'll be in the record. But just a couple updates from the division. We remain very, very busy at historic staffing lows and historic resource lows, and significant resource constraints on the horizon that can significantly impact the level of service that we're going to be providing to the public, to the regulated community, and to EPA likely next year if some additional resources are not found. But at this time, our division has 321 permit applications in-house across the division. 219 of those are Title V permit applications that's spread across about 19 staff right now. Working on those. So just gives you a quick snapshot in terms of one small piece of our program, an important piece of our program, and kind of the workload that we're facing in that area with very limited resources. You heard earlier about the forthcoming changes to the Vehicle Emissions Inspection and Maintenance Program. That's the INM program that was mentioned in Katie's remarks. When EPA approves that change to our state air plan in the coming months, that will result in a financial cliff for our division of about over $2 million. So you can understand when most of our revenue goes towards staff salary, what the potential pinch point will be for us next year when that financial cliff occurs if we do not get some assistance on revenue replacement. But that's what's top of mind for me right now, and what keeps me up at night is how we're going to make payroll in the spring and meet the needs of our growing and very busy state. So anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. We'll do some comments, starting with Chair Solomon.
No. Good.
Commissioner Wright.
No additional comments.
No additional comment.
No. Any comments?
No additional comments, just sorry to hear those remarks from the director.
Commissioner Smith?
No.
Nothing to add. Thank you.
Nothing to add. Okay, then we're adjourned.